Welcome to Peter's podcast, where we talk about real yoga, actual happiness, and deep living. Thanks for joining me. I have a very special guest today on Peter's podcast. Brian McLaren is a high school friend of mine. He is now, though, a former English professor. He was a pastor for 24 years. He's now an author, an activist, a public theologian, a frequent guest lecturer. I heard him on Krista Tippett's show a while back, which was a great delight. His work has been covered in Time, in Newsweek, in USA Today, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN. He's the author of more than 15 books, including Faith After Doubt, Do I Stay Christian, and A New Kind of Christian. And he's a faculty member of the Living School at the Center for Action and Contemplation. And Brian currently lives in Florida. So I hope you enjoy this discussion. It's about a really important book that Brian wrote that came to my attention. And I think it will be valuable for everyone to at least be aware of it. And here we go. Hi, Brian.
Peter, man, I'm happy to be with you.
Yeah, it's so great. For my regular audience, this gentleman and I went to high school together.
It's just yesterday.
Yeah, and we haven't had a chance to be in touch much since then. And you've gone off and done a lot of wonderful things
You.
and have found yourself sort of leading a charge that's unique and important. And I wanted to share that with folks who listen to this podcast. You tackled something that a lot of people have been ignoring completely, which is that we're not really doing that much about the climate, and the climate doesn't care about that.
Yes. Yeah, we don't get a grade for effort.
So this book is Life After Doom, and we're going to talk a little bit about what you mean by that word doom. But what was the motivation to make this book? What brought you to, because it's quite an opus. I mean, it's almost like you're creating an entire practice for us.
Well, I'm glad you appreciate it that way. Peter, I wrote a book in 2000. I think it came out in 2007. It was a book about global crises, and that I had been aware of climate change, but I probably back in those days saw it as one of many problems. Later, I came to see it as the problem that makes every other problem worse and harder to solve. But since writing that book, I just kind of kept track of all of the different global crises that I had researched for the book, and came to understand that that the challenges that we face with climate change are really are unique. And as my friend Bill McKibben says, this is a timed test. He said to me once, winning too slowly is the same as losing. So that has, been a high part. It's something sort of on the back burner for me all the time. It's really on the front burner, but it's not on the front burner for many other people. So I have to pretend like it's on the back burner, I suppose. So when in I guess 2021, I had a 2-book contract with a new publisher, and this book was the second of the 2 books. But my publisher came back to me and said, everybody in our office needs that book right now on Life After Doom. So she said, any chance you could move it up? So that's what her urgency synergized well with my own sense of urgency.
Yeah, that's wonderful that it did come out now.
Yeah.
I would like to have you do the 4 scenarios of what you describe as where we likely are. And also, I'd love for you to describe how you defined doom. You went a little bit historical with that word. So I don't care
Yes.
which order you do them in.
Okay. Well, let me say something about doom. First of all, I'm glad I used that in the title, but it also, I sort of knew that it was a risk because the word doom sucks all the air out of a room. So the title is Life After Doom. Nobody hears the life or the after, they only hear doom. And then the subtitle is Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. They hear falling apart and don't hear wisdom and courage because I think we're all, our nervous systems are activated, and we tend to go to the biggest danger. But the way I define it for the early in the book is I say that doom is a psychological experience that rushes through our nervous system when we realize that our problems are bigger than our solutions.
Mm.
I think so many of us were raised in a world where a little more money, a little more time, a little more expertise, and our problems would be easy to solve. Change the election, our problems would be easy to solve. But uh, experts in this world for the last 4 or 5 years have been using this term multi-crisis or polycrisis or meta-crisis, a way of saying when you have several different crises that come together to form one coherent whole, and each of them makes the others harder to solve. When people start to see that, it it shakes us up. It challenges a lot of, well, maybe I could call them illusions, but they're really our assumptions about how the world works, and it creates real anxiety. I later in the book I gave a little historical background on the word doom. It actually uh, originally meant a law. In fact, we know it in the word domain.
Mm.
Um, a domain is where somebody can make the laws, and or a domain is a place where a certain set of laws rule.
Hmm.
And so then that word doom came to mean people who have broken the law and have been caught, but yet
Interesting.
have not yet been sentenced. And so it has a kind of interesting etymology in that way. Maybe the other thing I'll say, Peter, is that it's one of the reasons why I have great respect for people who do, one of many reasons I have respect for people who do the kind of work you do in the world, helping people learn how to inhabit their bodies and feel what's going on and learn some art of self regulation. Um, because one of the things that happens is that when people feel a kind of panic come over them, um, very often it pushes them to not act in the ways that would be most helpful. So that's the big picture on doom. Um, then what I tried to do in the book, and I felt like this was one of the main contributions of the book, is I tried to take all the literature out there and and get as much understanding as I could consolidate, and then say, okay, what are the likely outcomes? What are the paths forward? And the first thing I want to say is that I think it's unwise for people to ask the question, what's going to happen? First of all, nobody knows. But second of all, there's a way we can ask that that makes us say, well, this is going to happen. I'll just adjust.
Hmm.
Um, and the act of saying something's going to happen, I'll adjust, takes us out of the equation as protagonists in our own unfolding drama.
Right.
So I share these to say I don't know which of these will unfold. I encourage people not to rush to certainty, uh, but to understand this is a pretty, I think, a pretty comprehensive vision of our options. So the first, and all of them are framed around the word collapse, and collapse means civilizational collapse. Um, I think we all understand. In fact, we probably understand today more than we did a year ago or 5 years ago that our what we call civilization, the political, economic, religious, social uh, conventions and norms that work together for this thing called civilization to happen, they're fragile.
Hmm.
Um, and they aren't eternal. Every civilization that has ever existed in the past, we know about its ruins, we know about its rise and its fall. So they're all built around collapse. First is collapse avoidance, that we could see how much trouble we're in, especially in relation to how we're exploiting the earth and heating up the earth. Second option, well, I should say that first option, we see how much harm we're doing, and we pull together and we make the right decisions in the right amount of time. Now it's already too late to avoid any impacts. We're 40
We're
years
already
too late for
seeing
that.
them.
We're already seeing them. So now the issue is, how can we avoid the most catastrophic impacts? So collapse avoidance. Second, we don't understand and pull together and do what we need to do fast enough. There is a collapse, but before it reaches its worst outcomes, there are great costs in terms of human life and well-being. But some number of us learn what needs to be done. And we could call that a collapse rebirth scenario. And they would be able to take the best from the past and learn the lessons from our failures, and give birth to a new civilization that we could only imagine would be, in many ways, we would hope, smarter than and better than this one. The third is collapse survival. And this would say, well, we are still a little too late even to have a rebirth. And so there'll be survival, but not in what we would recognize as a civilization as we know it. One way to say it is, our lives would probably go back 500 years and 600 years in time in terms of our standard of living and so on. And then the
Or even
fourth
the way that
is
we
collapse.
interact with each other in a global way. Like it would be more
Yes,
local, communities or whatever.
exactly right. Exactly right. There would be local societies. We could talk more about this if you like, but there are a number of people who are called macro historians, who try to look at the big sweeps of history, and they say that feudalism has been a kind of uh, a, uh, a bottom line for human organization in significant numbers. One way I heard someone say it once is that the life of a serf in ancient Egypt in 2200 BC was not that different from a life of a serf in England or France in 1600 AD. So it would be something like that. And then the fourth, collapse extinction, would suggest it is indeed very, very, very possible that we humans could let what we're doing to the earth go so out of control that we would make it impossible for our species and many other species to survive.
Yeah. And part of that would be our reaction to it, that we would come at each other for survival and
Exactly right.
fail.
I mean, we could create scenarios where literally it becomes too hot for humans to survive. But probably before that happened, the fear is that nuclear bombs would fly under enough tension and desperation, and that would hasten the catastrophic end.
Yeah. So let's get to the other half of your titles.
Yes.
But it's good to set that as a sort of a frame, so that we know that the
Yes.
stuff we're talking about is important, and it's important to deal with
Yes.
now.
Yes.
Yeah. So what I loved about the way you presented this, and I said a moment ago, a practice, and obviously that's what
Yes.
I work with, a practice, right? And this practice is
Yes.
about identifying what it is that's important. And so
Yes.
much of it you address in your book, these things that are transient and not really what
Yes.
we're built to learn in our project
Yes.
called life. And how do we get to that? So you named your titles of the parts: letting go, a path of descent; letting be, a path of insight; letting come, a path of resilience; and setting free, a path of agile engagement.
Yes.
What is that practice?
Yes.
I mean, you wrote
Yes.
a whole book, so you can be summary like.
Yes. Well, um, uh, you know, Peter, I am sure that if you bring together a group of people, to practice yoga and you know that you have an hour, and uh, I'm sure whether consciously or just because of intuition developed through experience, you understand you want to take people on a journey. You want to help them start where they are, get in a kind of a flow, and you have a place you want to bring them, so that when they leave in a different state in which they from which they came. And and I think something like that is what I'm trying to do in the book. In other words, I don't just think what people need is information or even marching orders or something like that. I think a climate change world is going to require climate changed people. Um, a world shaped by fossil fuels and capitalism and racism and white supremacy and religious warfare and bigotry and so on. A world that's shaped by those things, for us to break through to a better world, those things have to be faced and dealt with inside of each of us. And so, so letting go is the process of saying what we're doing isn't working, and
Mhm.
trying harder at what we're doing won't will perpetuate the very problem we're trying to solve, until there is enough in us that is let go of, and uh, 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 that we'll keep trying to solve the problems with the conditions that created them.
Yeah, and you make the
Um,
point based, I guess, on your research that letting go, the piece that isn't working, is that we're so attached to spending energy
yes,
that is so expensive for the planet, but so cheap for
yes,
us to consume.
yes, 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 yes. So this was in writing this book, Peter, people like me see fossil fuels as a problem, but we use them every day because they become a solution for so many other problems. And I remember as I was writing the book, I I came away with an even greater admiration for the power of fossil fuels. I mean, they are magic. I think I compare them in the book, although I don't have a lot of experience with this, but I compare them to crack. In other words, they just take you into a different place very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And and I mean, what we've done with fossil fuels is incredible. Um, and uh, and now to imagine living without them uh, is terrifying to people, especially in the short term, and especially to the people who are making a whole lot of money and holding on to a lot of power because of them. Interestingly, I mean, this was not true 15 years ago. It is true now. We actually do have all the technologies we need to live without fossil fuels. It would just require a level of discipline that uh, and a level of political and spiritual and economic leadership that our civilizations don't have.
Mm-hmm.
But the technological possibilities are there. So that's part of what we have to let go of, and then we have to let go of our dependence on fossil fuels. We have to let go of some deeper things too. Someone I quote in the book, a Nigerian or West African philosopher named Bayo Kamalafe. Bayo says, "What if our way of responding to the problem is part of the problem?" So you think about, I mean, it's almost a cliche, but you imagine sort of an angry, domineering father, and his kid comes and tells him, "Dad, you're too bossy and you're too domineering and you yell too much." "Well, what do you expect me to do about it?" And of course, his response to the problem perpetuates the problem. We have a way of doing that. I'll just give you an example. Um, we are increasing the use of solar energy at a very fast rate, which is a wonderful thing, except that we're increasing our total energy use
Mm-hmm.
even more. So the more what we do is, instead of replacing old sources of energy with new sources, we just and then add it to the old sources and consume even more
Right.
energy. So this, there are so many levels to this, but yeah, that's part of the letting go process, and it, I think, ultimately involves a kind of letting go of assumptions around the word progress,
Mm-hmm.
that that the world has to get better off every year, um, that we, each of us as individuals, needs to make more money than we did 5 years ago, and that we need new technology, and that we never can stop. And in a certain sense, just as we have this reckoning with fossil fuels, I think we have this reckoning with our current economic assumptions, because um, our economy is built on growth.
Right.
Uh, and and one way to describe growth, we typically measure growth through gross domestic product, um, GDP. But one way to describe GDP is the speed at which we consume the earth.
Mhm.
And until we find a different way of measuring well-being and prosperity, well, that's another one of the things of letting go. We're
Yeah.
going to have to let go of a lot of assumptions sooner or later. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a big ask.
Yes. And I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think in the practice that you, and I'm sure many of our listeners, teach, part of what we do is try to help people get out of the little ruts of mental activity. I need more of this. I need more of that. I have to do this. I'm running late on that. And this whole mindset of, in a certain sense, having a program running in our heads
Yeah.
that we weren't born with, and that people lived with for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years without. That's one of the things we're going to have to get in
Yeah.
touch with, some of those programs that are running in us.
Yeah. I think the marketplace's way of describing things, measurement tools, have taken
Yes,
over everything.
everything.
Even art and things that have no
Yes.
purpose other than being beauty expressed are now subject to all these criteria.
Oh my.
It's crazy. I had
Oh
I
my.
had a teacher who, very much to what you were saying, in your practice would say, you don't have to practice as though you're trying to get somewhere, as though you're not
Yes.
already somewhere. You are life itself.
Yes. 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 Oh my goodness. In so many spiritual practices, this is the key. I was just talking to a Buddhist friend of mine the other day, and she said she remembers when she kept going to her teacher and complaining about, how bad she was at her practice. And she said she was remembering how hard it was for her teacher to help her ever even acknowledge that the very act of constantly measuring how good she was one of the things that she was trying to break out of.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. Well, let's get to letting be.
Yes. Letting be is what maybe folks in recovery might call hitting bottom, but it's a place where we realize our current coping strategies aren't working. And we have this kind of reckoning where we maybe say words we've never said before. I don't know what to do.
Hmm.
I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know. I don't know if we're going to make it. Um, I just listened to a brilliant interview with, I'm not going to mention a name here, but really one of the premier activists of this generation, who has just gone through this kind of a reckoning. And someone asked him, the interviewer asked him, well, could you give us an example of an area you've been wrong? And he said, I feel I've been wrong about everything because I assumed everything was easy to solve. It just needed my intelligence. It just needed my energy. It just needed my good ideas. And then it would be solved. And he said, now I'm realizing that that attitude in itself is a problem. And this is in many ways what in a lot of different spiritual practices people call achieving, or achieve isn't the right word, but arriving or experiencing the beginner's mind.
Yes.
I thought I had it all figured out. I don't. I've got to look at the world again. I think this is actually what religious terms like born again or rebirth or new beginnings. These are all about. They get understood in a thousand opposite ways, but I think at their deepest, this is what they mean: coming to a beginner's mind. A word like repentance means not only it means think again. It means
Hmm.
have question your way of thinking to the point that you are ready to learn how to think all over again. And that kind of process normally doesn't happen without some amount of pain. And I think as we look around the world, we realize, yeah, there's going to be a certain amount of pain for our culture and civilizations at large to have the kind of awakening that's going to be necessary, the change of mind and change of heart. The recent election has done this for a lot of people in the climate change world because they were looking and saying, America can't go that way because of the outsized role we play in
Right.
climate change in the world. And now they're having to face, well, America did go that way. And now we've got to rethink. So this is a painful process, but when people experience it, there is a kind of liberation, not a liberation from caring or trying, but a liberation from a set of assumptions.
Right. How it's
We
going to
reach a
look.
place where we say, it's going to be different than we thought,
Yeah.
and not only the destination but the path there. And that is where letting be has to last long enough that we actually are reduced in some ways to curiosity and openness and imagination, and not only openness to other people's ideas but openness to what might rise up inside of us.
Yeah. It's sort of like the
Just a
gift of
quick example.
humility.
Yes, yes. I mean, this is a very personal example, and it's in a totally different realm of the scope. But a dear friend of mine, several years ago, his wife died at a relatively young age of a stroke one night in her
Mm.
sleep, and it just was totally, nobody ever could have seen this coming. And we were talking, and he said, "The entire future I've thought of is gone. It is gone." And over the next several months, he was in a letting be phase. I don't know what I'm going to do. I just know that the future I'd planned was gone. I just got an email from him a couple weeks ago, and a new adventure came. And now he's doing something he never would have imagined doing before. I'm sure if he could go back, he'd rather have his wife
Right.
still alive, but she's gone. And he has now found a new adventure in life. And that's the letting be has to last long enough for us to be ready for the letting come.
Yeah.
And that's that third phase. And that's where new imaginations come. And we're open to new ideas. Um, uh, yeah, I'll just give one example. Um, uh, for people brought up in a capitalist economy, we have all these assumptions that are so primal, so pre-critical, so deeply embedded in us. It's not that we don't want to imagine a non-capitalist world. We can't.
Yeah.
It's our framing of what the world is and what reality is. But what if I'm my next book coming out next year is a science fiction novel, and one of my purposes in the novel, and one of the things that science fiction does, is by putting people in another time or on another planet, it makes us be able to imagine things that we can't imagine in this time on this planet. And it's a civilization that works without money,
Yeah.
and uh, uh, and uh, just as we say, well, that could never happen. Why would we want to do that? Well, listen, for many, many thousands of years, human civilizations operated with slavery.
Hmm.
And they not only couldn't imagine a civilization, uh, they would say, why would you want to? It was
Right.
such a part. Or people operated with men in charge and women in a submissive, subordinate position. Uh, they couldn't, both men and women were very often that was the boundary conditions for their imagination.
Right.
And I think this is something that some amount of letting go and letting be prepares us for a new letting come of different possibilities.
Yeah. I was just thinking of this like common television plot where the kids get taken off to a cabin or something and they're just freaking
Yes,
out like what are we supposed to do here, and yet they do adjust and it becomes a rich experience,
yes,
like on the on the side of your book that is not the doom side, but the
Yes.
life after,
Yes.
there is the
Yes.
possibility of something that still feels rich, that still feels beautiful, that feels somehow evolved from this
Yes.
thing we've been stuck in that we can't imagine not
Yes.
being in.
Peter, that helps me. Maybe one way I could say it is when we say the word progress, we mean progress within a world just like ours. Um, but what we have to imagine is a better life that could emerge
Mm-hmm.
under a different set of conditions,
Yeah.
conditions that we would never choose because of who we are, but conditions in which our great great grandchildren could actually find out that they're far more alive and far better off than we are,
Yeah.
and we can't imagine it. Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned, and I can't remember if it was in the second part or this third part, was we can look to other peoples who have gone through similar
Yes.
levels of devastation. And you bring up Native
Yes.
Americans, you bring up slaves, you bring up
Yes.
Jews, and so forth.
Yes. Yes. Uh, I I African American woman who I work closely with. She's Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis. She's a minister in New York City, and we were together talking once, and she talked to me about something that I, as a white guy, it was like a conversation that was going on among Black folk here in America forever. But I literally felt I'd never heard of this conversation. Um, and what she let me in on was that to be Black in America means you imagine your ancestors who were enslaved for many, many generations. And they were born into slavery. They lived their lives in slavery. They had children. They died in slavery. And for many years in American history, a person would die, an enslaved person would die, and slavery was worse than it was when they were born. And they knew their children were coming into a worse era where they would be treated even worse than they had as parents. And yet they stayed alive. And what I remember what Jackie explained to me is she said, when I live, I'm aware of my ancestors who lived and died in the hopes that someday someone like me would be able to be alive.
Mm.
And she said, so I live with a sense of them, like my mother's hand is on my shoulder and her mother's hand is on her shoulder. I live with this sense and this awareness that that her ancestors experienced the end of the world in Senegal uh, or Nigeria or wherever in West Africa. Her ancestors, the world ended for them,
Yeah.
but uh, they persisted and survived. And now here are people who are alive and say, I feel in my own body and DNA and blood this awareness that the world ended for other people, and and they in some ways lived in hope that I would be alive. And yeah, it's a profound thing to
Yeah.
realize. I In the book I quote a really interesting guy I have so much respect for. His name is Stephen Charleston. He is a Choctaw elder, and he's a retired Episcopal bishop, an unusual combination of deep deep spirituality. And he wrote a book called "We Survived the End of the World,"
Mm.
and he looks back on how the end of the world came for the indigenous people here when a group of undocumented illegal immigrants came across a border from Europe, and
Yeah.
uh, and and so and of course that brings all the ironies of their descendants now,
Yeah.
the descendants of those first immigrants now hating or being
Immigration.
dehumanizing other immigrants. But the world is ending for different people,
Yeah.
um, and 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 part of what we start to realize is I happen to be living in this time, and life is bigger than me, humanity is bigger than me, it's bigger than our generation, and we start thinking in those bigger time frames.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, the guidance of those peoples who have gone through this before points at revaluing what it is that you're living for, you know,
Yes, yes,
that it wasn't those things that we thought were the important things or the things we had to have.
yes,
And it makes you peel layers of that onion of life. Like, why
yes,
are we here? Who are we? What is this?
yes. It raises questions that give meaning to our individual lives because we look for a meaning that's bigger in time and space and so on. It's a bigger frame. Yes.
Yeah.
It's one of the things probably that we let go of in that descent is saying the only thing that matters is how much comfort and pleasure and status and so on that I have right now. Um, we have bigger frames.
Yeah. And then there was a chapter I wrote the title down of, and maybe you can put this in the right place in this journey, because after the last election, myself, a lot of people are in certain places in the stages of
Yeah,
grief, and one of them
yeah,
is screw this, I'm not going to get involved in
yeah,
that anymore. But your chapter
yeah.
title was When Life Gets Tough, We Get Tougher.
Yes, yes. Yes, and that's part of the last phase, which letting go, letting be, letting come, and then the last I call setting free, and that's where we feel some new possibilities have come, and we're free now to live and pursue them. Um, and uh, I think we're all still in the process of processing what this most recent election means about our country and our political system and so on, but that reaction that you mentioned of wow, screw this, this feeling like, well, that didn't work. We worked really, really hard, and it didn't work. We've been working at this for 10 years, and what we were fighting against 10 years ago seems like it became stronger rather than weaker.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean that we were wrong to try, but what it might mean is, well, maybe we just need to work harder. Or maybe some of us need to work harder at doing the same things. But maybe there are new things that we need to do that we never paid attention to. Um, and that's part of that process, letting go that just work harder. Well, maybe just working harder or doing the same things won't work. Maybe what we're then set free to say, maybe there are other kinds of actions and activism that matter more. Maybe there are other approaches. Maybe there are, and of course there are experts who this is their day job and
Right.
and who are talking about this, every day. Um, but uh, I also think there's something in each of us where we each go. We don't just listen to the experts; we also listen to our own heart,
Yeah.
and we say, "What's mine to do at this time?" And
Because
that's
getting
part of being set free as well.
because getting tougher doesn't just mean getting angrier. It
Yes,
has to
it means
be,
getting stronger
yeah, in a
and
bigger
getting
way.
smarter. So in the book, I talk about in that chapter, I talk about we have to get stronger intellectually. Um, we have to think harder than we were thinking, or think bigger, or think more creatively, or maybe we have to become self-critical. Uh, you know, if I'm in the Democratic Party, I have to say, what is our party not facing? What are the realities we have to face? We have to get tougher in facing reality.
Yeah.
Um, or uh, sometimes it might mean to say, well, we it's like being in the fourth quarter of a game and there's a moment where you say, well, we're playing basketball and we're behind by 32 points and there's only 4 minutes left. So what's realistic in the next 4 minutes? We
Yeah.
could just walk off the court and be bad sports. We could start fouling just out of anger. Or we could say, let's play with some dignity and let's see if we could put together 4 minutes of good play in these terrible circumstances. And when this game is over, we'll then deal with the next game or the next season or whatever. But there's a toughness that comes in those times, and that's the kind of toughness I was talking about.
Yeah, and you mentioned that same feeling in the book, not with the basketball metaphor, but just with this, like, even if you knew you only had so long to live,
Yes,
how
yes,
would you want to live that? Would you want to
yes,
collapse? Would you want to
yes,
do the best you could for those loved ones? Would you carry on? And I think
yes,
we need to have that kind of willingness to take life as it comes. You know, it goes all
yes,
the way to Viktor Frankl and the man's search for meaning notion, right? It's like,
yes,
how do you endure impossible situations? And
yes,
those who can find the larger sense of self within that, I think, have a more I was going to say satisfying, but it's even much bigger than that. It's like the
yes.
holier life.
Yes, 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 yes. As you're saying this, we're having this conversation in the days after the long-standing Syrian regime fell, and people might be listening to this at very different times, but this is fresh on our minds right now. And I was thinking about this and thinking, imagine that you had worked in the Syrian government, so you were part of the Assad regime, and let's say you're a good person and you were really trying to make the regime less brutal and less cruel. And in your little place of influence, you were trying to work for a better regime. And you thought, I want to keep this regime going because a lot of those militia groups out there that are trying to overtake us, if they take control, things will even be worse. And
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine a person really, really working hard. And now that's over.
Yeah.
And now they have to say, okay, how do I want to invest my life now? Then I imagine somebody who was in one of these militia groups and they were aware of how terrible the Assad regime was. And they said, we got to tear this thing down. Well, now they did. And now they have this interesting challenge. Are they going to try to be good governors of a situation where they've won? You know what? That might turn out to be harder than what they were previously doing. So whatever happens, whether you win or you lose, you have these moments where you have to say, what kind of a person do I want to be?
Mm-hmm.
And accept that new challenge.
Yeah. And part of the difficulty with that comes from the places of privilege that we find ourselves. You know, so
Yes,
we have our lives in front of us, and we can get so caught up in
yes,
those issues that we don't even see other people's issues. And I think that's
yes,
one of the places that, as you say, we have to rethink, what are
yeah,
we doing? We have to look at
yeah,
what are other people experiencing and what can we do about that.
yeah, yeah. That's right. And there's a lot of grief, and there's a lot of sadness, and there's a lot of just wave after wave of emotions that we cope with, whether it's in politics or whether it's facing the biosphere, our whole planet, and how much trouble it's in. And and we go through wave after wave of emotion. And I think we have to give ourselves permission to, you get knocked in the gut, and you can't just stand up and smile. You you
Mm-hmm.
you got some pain. Um, but eventually we get to this place where we say, okay, what's my new reality? Um, and how can I show up in this in a way that is true to who I am and true to what's needed?
And what works in my life as well, because we have limited personal resources to use. So we
That's
work in our
exactly right.
sphere.
Yes, exactly right. You know, uh, one of my heroes in my life has become Saint Francis.
Mm.
And Saint Francis had all these big, big dreams and ideals, big things he tried to do, um, and he didn't really succeed. I'm not sure he succeeded at any of them in the way that he would have wished. But what happened to him is he became an amazing human being in the process, and he modeled a different way of life in the process. And there, his brothers who were around him as he died, and he died, I forget the exact year, but it was rather young, quite a young age, partly because he didn't take good care of himself. But uh, the last thing he said is, I have done what is mine to do. You do what is yours to do. And what to me is beautiful about that is he's saying, I think he's coming to terms with all of my big dreams didn't happen, but I gave it my best shot. But then he doesn't say, you guys keep doing what I was doing.
Right.
He sets them free to say, find out what's yours to do. And I think that's a gift we can give each other while we're still alive.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I wanted to conclude by asking you. We know each other because of music. That
Yes.
was what pulled us together in school, and both of us have spent time at musicians during our lives. Um,
Yeah.
in your book, you mentioned art a few times. About the
Yeah.
power of poetry,
Yeah.
the power of turning to these non-intellectual pursuits as ways
Yeah.
to solve and ways to be with.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so one way to think about, we were talking about yoga, which is your area of great expertise. We can think about it as something that we do to help regulate our nervous system. Um, and a set of practices that people might not right away think is about regulation of nervous system, but among many other things, that is part of what's happening. And we might not think of art in that way either, but I look at art among many other dimensions of what art is doing. For example, poetry differs from prose in that it requires us to slow down. It tells us we're going to gain clarity here, not by adding more and more words and sentences. We're going to gain clarity through the careful construction and selection of words. And so both in the creation and then in the reading of poetry, it requires us to slow down. Uh, that very act, it changes us. We go to a concert and we're in a room full of people, and we allow all of our bodies to start to move to the same beat. We allow all of our brains to be taken by the same lyrics and the same melodies and the same harmonies in ways that we can't even understand, but they work on us. And we go into this space together and we share this experience. In between songs, we smack our hands together as if to say, let's, uh, like, remember Etch a Sketch? Let's shake the Etch a Sketch to let the old picture be over so we can get ready for the next picture that's going to come. I mean, we go through this amazing thing together. Uh, that is really magic. I feel this as a writer. Uh, you know, I'm working for, I don't know, thousands of hours writing a book because I understand that a reader is trusting me with 8 or 12 or 15 or 20 hours of their life. And they're not just trusting me with the time, but they're, in a certain sense, allowing my words to crawl into their brain and do some work there. A sculptor works on this thing. It doesn't involve words usually, it's shapes. And the sculptor understands people are going to stop and observe this and let these shapes and colors and textures affect them. And I mean, it's an amazing gift that we give each other, and that we enjoy together in the arts, each in their own way. And I can't help but think, obviously, words play a part of filmmaking and writing and so on. But I can't help but think that it's what goes, that as important as the words are, the part of this that goes beyond the words is part of what is we're letting in and attending to and letting have an effect inside our body. And the fact that it's happening in some other bodies too binds us together in some way. My goodness, that feels like magic.
Absolutely. It is magic.
Uh,
I mean, that's something that more and more I've come to appreciate from doing this yoga and meditation practice. I had a chance to
Yeah.
speak to a neuroscientist who got intrigued with psychic phenomena and
Mm.
found all kinds of research that validates how much we are more than simply
Yes.
this little
Yes.
shape, right? So
Yes. Yes.
it's great.
Yeah. It, we need access points
Yeah.
to open to, open to a depth that is always there. But it is amazingly easy to skate over the surface and not be aware of the depth or dimensions that are, yeah,
Yeah.
that remain mysterious to us. It's not like these experiences make it all clear to us. It's just that we allow ourselves to acknowledge them as part of our human
Yeah.
experience.
And they expand our sense of what that is,
Yeah.
which gives
Yes.
us hope. Although you describe
Yes.
hope in the book as not meaning don't do
Complicated.
anything.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
Well, Brian, delightful to speak with you. And I hope everyone reads your book. It's so powerful and so important. So thank you.
Well, it means a lot to me that you found it helpful, Peter, and what a joy to be with you. And I can only imagine the wonderful people who enjoy this podcast. So
Oh,
it's a pleasure to be with them as well.
great. All right. Thank you.